Hello and welcome to this Global Politics video interview on the privatisation of warfare. My name is David Van Rooyen, and sitting next to me is Dr. Pietro Maffettone, who is a lecturer of global politics here at the University of Durham. Our guest today is Dr. James Pattison, who is a senior lecturer of politics at the University of Manchester. Dr. Pattison, welcome to Durham and welcome to Global Politics.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, we're going to be talking about the privatisation of war and more specifically the ethical aspects of private war.
Yeah.
Before we go on to talk about that, could you briefly give us some sort of conceptual analysis of what, first of all, private war means, but also who's involved in private war, private security contractors, who are they, what do they do?
Yeah, sure, yeah, I'm more than happy to. So the focus of my work isn't private war per se, because that involves lots of different non-state actors, but a particular form of non-state actor, which is private military security companies. So private military security companies have increasingly become prevalent in the international system, so over the past few decades. And so what they do, various different roles, much of the focus in the media and international attention has been in terms of the armed security sector. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, armed contractors providing protection services. But that's just one small part of the industry. The industry also does logistical services, such as some of the quite more menial tasks involved in supporting the regular armies in conflict zones, and also training, various other services as well.
Okay, I heard a statistic that during the first Gulf War, there were 100 soldiers to every one private contractor.
Yeah.
In 2008, in the second Gulf War, the ratio had equalised at 1 to 1.
Yeah.
Why has there been such a dramatic increase of private contractors?
Yeah, I'd actually say that the ratio is even greater than that in Afghanistan. So there'd be more private contractors in Afghanistan at certain points than there were regular soldiers. So it's even gone beyond one for one. Just to kind of elaborate a bit more, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of private contractors. So why has there been that move? So I think there are two main reasons for the push for increased privatisation. And the first is just, this is part of the general neoliberal trend that we've got, where there's been privatisation, belief in neoliberal politics, privatisation of other areas, so education, health, utility services. The next logical step was military services. So as part of this neoliberal belief that private companies can and should be doing this on the neoliberal view. So that's more kind of the economic side, or ideological side, I should say. There's also a political element to it. So it's viewed by certain governments that this is something that politically reduces the costs of going to war in terms of the domestic pressures that they face. So private contractors don't necessarily receive the same amount of media attention when they're killed in conflict zones as do regular soldiers. Also, there's a perception, although I don't necessarily agree with this perception, that it saves money. So the suggestion is that it saves money because when you're hiring PMSCs, private military security companies, you only need to actually employ them when you're fighting a war. You don't need to employ them when you're at peace. By contrast, with the regular military, you need to pay them throughout the whole. Forever, ongoing, you need to pay them. So that's another. There is that perception. I don't necessarily believe that they are cost effective, but there is that perception, at least in the short term, that it saves money, and this relates into political pressure then for political decision makers who are under pressure to cut budgets, limited budgets. They think, well, this is one way to potentially save money.
Yeah. So if I can jump in, I guess that we're here to talk about the ethical aspects of the use of private military contractors. And I guess from your introduction, one of the first themes that one could pick up is there a sense in which the use of private military contractors makes international conflict more likely? If the costs to governments, the costs of war in terms of publicity, but also perhaps economically, although you said you buy into the economic argument. But if the costs are reduced, is this an incentive, or at least a way of making conflict easier, in a sense?
In short, yes. So yes. So So one of the main actual ethical issues I think relates to this issue, that it increases the likelihood of conflict in the international system. So I'll say a little bit more. So I think there are various ways that it increases conflict. In terms of, first of all, the times that there will actually be the resort to force in the first place, and secondly, when there is the resort to force, the horrors of the war, if you like. So the degree of force that's actually involved, I think, can be exacerbated. So I think some of the formal constraints on war that we find in international law can be circumvented and bypassed by using private military security companies. Second, I think that some of the informal constraints that we have, so some of the norms that we have in international society about the fact that you shouldn't be resorting force that don't quite meet the standards of international law, can also be bypassed. So those are two quick concerns. But more generally, in terms of international instability, this kind of relates to your objection, to your consideration about democracies and the fact that they can use these to wage more easily because the costs. Yeah, that's a certain consideration. But there's also other ways that it loosens the constraints on not going to war. So governments can use private military security companies to, not simply because of the economic costs, but political costs, to go to war more easily. I also think that there are issues with non-state actors hiring private military security companies themselves, such as major transnational companies, which potentially increases the likelihood of conflict. So you get this in certain areas that are rich in resources. So this is another issue where there might be increased international instability. Now, it might not necessarily be more wars per se, but my point is international conflict. So the worry is that by increasing the amount of arms, the increasing amount of people that are providing protection services, there's a real worry that there's going to be increased international instability.
Your position on private contractors is based quite heavily on just war theory.
Yeah.
What specific elements of just war theory do you draw upon? I read one of your papers that you focus quite a lot on the effectiveness of the military.
Yeah.
Is that the most important factor of just war theory for you?
To some extent, yeah. So I've developed these papers into a book that's I try and flesh out my ideas in terms of just war theory a bit more so systematically in relation to private military security companies. So I don't think there's any one particular part of just war theory that's necessarily that much more important than any others. I would view just war theory as making a series of necessary conditions that anyone has to meet, and also some desirable conditions that can improve the moral justifiability of certain actions. Now, in terms of private military security companies, something that I think it highlights in terms of just war theory that's often not looked into, which is what I call the issue of the moral legitimacy of the military. So when we're fighting a just war, we are when we think about just war theory, there's often not really a consideration of which military is actually that's doing the fighting. So we tend to think, does the war meet standard jus ad bellum criteria? So has it got is the war just in terms of its cause? Is it the last resort? Has it got a reasonable prospect of success? Has it got legitimate authority? Is it going to be proportionate? So on and so forth. Now, one thing that's not considered then is actually who's doing the fighting itself. And so you might think that actually in certain times this is a really relevant consideration to whether it's going to be permissible to resort to force. So you might think, for instance, the war in Vietnam was problematic, not simply because it failed to meet a lot of those standard just war criteria, but because it was a conscript force where the conscription was highly problematic, and the conscripts didn't have a choice whether to fight or not. Now, I think private military and security companies also highlights this issue of the moral legitimacy of the military. So we need to think about, in terms of just war theory, the fact that there are a whole host of issues related to private military and security companies that would be missed on standard accounts of just war theory that tend to just focus on these criteria. So issues to do with the fact that contractors might not have duties of care respected from their employers, or the fact that contractors might not necessarily be private military and security companies, the way that they organise force might not be as representative as, say, all volunteer force or a conscripted army. So there are various issues, I think, that push us to think more about the moral legitimacy of the military dismissed by just war theory.
I guess one way to push this forward is the next important question is one of the main ethical aspects is related, I guess, to the kind of motives that those who are members of those who are private military contractors bring to the dimension of conflict. And I was wondering whether there is a sense in which the type of motives that we are likely to find among those who participate in the privatization of war, and especially those who work as private military contractors, to some extent disqualify their role within an armed conflict.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the central objections to private military and security companies, and it's the idea that if someone is motivated by financial gain, this means that they shouldn't be participating in war. You find this in a lot of the discussions in the literature on private military and security companies, but also more generally in the public debate on whether there should be private military and security companies. Now, I think that actually the argument does have some force. So I think that in general, individuals should be motivated by good reasons, just per se, for doing things, so they should be motivated by other concern and not simply by their own self-interest, to some degree at least. I also think that in warfare this is important. So when thinking in war, private military and security companies, if you're a contractor, you should be motivated by other regarding reasons and not simply your own self-interest. And then I think it is an empirical matter that private military and security contractors are more likely to be motivated by the wrong sorts of reasons, so self-interest, financial gain in particular, than regular than regular soldiers. Although I'd like to caveat that and say that I accept that private contractors are going to have a variety of different motivations for becoming private contractors, and so they might become a private contractor because they've been in the regular military, they've retired, and they want to continue to do something like they're doing, or they might even have family pressures, or they might actually see that being a private contractor is a way of being patriotic and helping their state out. So there are a whole variety of reasons why you might become a contractor. My claim is simply the more limited one, that it's more likely to think that private military and security companies, contractors, are going to be motivated by financial gain than regular soldiers. And this is simply because of the high wages on offer. This seems to provide a major incentive for individuals to become private contractors when they're regular soldiers.
What would be a typical wage, just to give a sense of the practical aspect of it?
It's very difficult to answer that because there's so many different roles, and it depends on whether you're a US and American former specialist regular military soldier, or whether you're a third country national, as they're called, or a local national, the terms that are used for. So if you're from a different state, so if you're from Uganda or Fiji or wherever, or if you're from a local national, so say if you're from Iraq or Afghanistan, and if you're hired, your wages are likely to be a lot lower, and you'll be likely to do more menial tasks. But still, generally, even then, the wages are often higher.
Comparatively, yes.
Yeah.
People who endorse private contractors would point to examples such as Sierra Leone, which seem to be quite a successful operation to do with private contractors. I think it was Executive Outcomes, a South African private military security company.
Yeah.
I think they sent about 150 people to Sierra Leone, managed to move the RUF rebel group away from the diamond fields, and broke a peace deal between the rebels and the government. What would your response be to that? Was it because they were private contractors, or would it have happened with all volunteer forces as well?
So in that particular case, it was unlikely that anything else would have happened. So one of the themes of my book is that actually in certain cases it can be, all things considered, morally permissible to hire private military security companies. And so part of my thinking when developing this theme was cases such as Sierra Leone. The details of the Sierra Leone case are disputed in the literature, so I don't want to make too much of that. But you can think more generally hypothetically. So what if there was a major humanitarian crisis, thousands of people dying, the regular military in the state isn't really able to do anything, or is potentially even involved in the violations of the human rights. The international community, for whatever reason, doesn't want to send peacekeepers, doesn't want to intervene, say NATO doesn't want to intervene. Would it then be potentially permissible to hire a private military and security company to assist the regular military to do something, as in the case of Sierra Leone, or even potentially intervene by itself? The latter is probably quite unlikely at the moment, but the former is certainly conceivable. Now, I think that it could be, all things considered, permissible, because the consequences of doing so would be, in that particular case, in terms of the improving the situation on the ground, stopping mass killing, in short, would outweigh all of the other moral problems that the use of private military and security companies poses in general. So I don't want to be an absolutist about this. I think that there can be cases where it can be, all things considered, permissible, although I think those are probably quite rare.
Yeah, so just to provide some sort of devil's advocate here, I mean, one objection to the use of private military contractors is that, I mean, many people would say that the use of force is something that we tend to associate for normative reasons to the state. Mm-hmm. Is there a sense in which the very status of a private military contractor is possible, justifiable from a normative point of view? Is there not some sort of oxymoron between private and military contractor, one could say?
Yeah, so that argument is sometimes pushed in the various literature and discussions around this, and I don't really buy it. So I think it is potentially legitimate to be a private contractor if you do absolutely everything right. And so my thought is that the state can potentially legitimately authorise private actors to do certain things, or individuals on an individual basis might be able to sometimes legitimately authorise other individuals. So say if I was, giving a hypothetical example, say if I was walking down the street and I was likely to be attacked. Now, and I could hire David to help as a private contractor to help look after me. Now, I think that I would have the right to be able to hire David on an individual basis at least, to protect myself. So you could think that something similar in terms of private contractors, that if you are under a threat, you have the right potentially to hire a private actor, to pay your private actor to protect your own basic interests. Now, there are various issues when it comes to the international system and thinking about states more generally, whether actually you want to go down that line. Because if you're actually allowing individuals that right, then might be unintended consequences where there will be abuses, and it can lead to a whole host of problems. So my thought is that we probably want to try and limit that right, but in principle at least, it would be potentially acceptable. And I don't think that the reasons for limiting that right will rule out all potential cases. And so back to the Sierra Leone case, I think that it might be all things considered permissible in exceptional cases still to hire private military and security companies.
One could say a practice that is not intrinsically wrong, although it may be in many or most circumstances very problematic in a way and not justifiable.
Yeah, so I hesitate to use the word intrinsically. I think that it depends exactly what you mean by intrinsically, and there's various discussions of that. So my view is that there are what I call deeper problems in the fact that even if there were effective systems of regulation, there would still be several problems raised by the use of private military and security companies. And you might call that intrinsic, you might not. Now, my view is that those reasons, deep, intrinsic, whatever you'd like to call them, are weighty, but not of absolute weight. And sometimes the consequences of the situation at hand will outweigh those other various considerations. And that's what makes it permissible to intervene, such as in cases the hypothetical Sierra Leone case.
I've got one final question for you, and it might sound cliched as a final question, but what do you think will be the future of private contractors? Are we going to see an increase, or is public opinion going to cause a move back to all volunteer forces?
Yeah, so I've just written and finished a book that says that we should try and eschew private military and security companies, and we should try and move away from private security military industry. But I'm sceptical that that's going to happen, at least in the short term. So my view is that actually there's going to be increased privatisation. So the UK and US, they've already privatised a significant part of the military, and I think there's struggles. There's not that much more that can be privatised without privatising the frontline services, which is not really a major move for. Where there will be a lot more movement, I think, is in terms of, firstly, private actors hiring private military security companies. So transnational companies, I think that's much more likely to happen in the future. But also non-Western states increasingly developing their own markets for force. So Russia have intimated that this is something that they're interested in because it can actually make it easier for them to pursue their own foreign policy agenda without some of the blatancy. Anyway, this is a report that I've heard. Anyway. Similar intimations, I think there was a report where it suggested that France had actually something similar, made some sort of similar suggestion. So my thought is that actually where there's been privatisation and the neoliberal pushes in the UK and US had that effect and led to privatisation, I think that neoliberal agenda will push out more generally globally, and so there'll be, in other states, there will be the privatisation of the militaries that are currently state-based. So I think the future of the private military industry is rosy, although that's not necessarily an ethically good thing.
Well, Dr. James Pattison,